The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Verde's dusty parade ground as Naalnish adjusted the leather straps on his pinto pony's saddle. At 3 feet 8 inches tall, he had learned long ago that regular horses were beyond his reach, literally and figuratively. But his small mare Ayoe was perfect for him, and together they could navigate terrain that would challenge any cavalry mount. "There's our Apache tracker," Sergeant O'Malley announced to the assembled patrol, his tone carrying the familiar mix of necessity and disdain that Naalnish had grown accustomed to. "Don't let his size fool you, boys. He can read sign better than any man in the territory." Lieutenant Harrison stepped forward, his blue uniform crisp despite the early hour. "Naalnish, we've got a situation. The Morrison ranch was hit yesterday at dawn. 3 Apache warriors took the rancher's daughter, Catherine Morrison, her father's offering a $1,000 reward for her safe return." Naalnish's weathered hands stilled on the saddle horn. The Morrison spread was one of the largest in the valley, and old Jeremiah Morrison was known for his harsh treatment of Apache prisoners. If his daughter had been taken, it wasn't likely to be for ransom. "How many riders in the war party?" Naalnish asked, his English careful and measured, each word chosen to avoid giving the soldiers more reason to mock him. 3, maybe 4 from what we could tell. Trailheads northeast, toward the Mogollon Rim. Harrison paused, studying the Apache tracker with calculating eyes. "Morrison specifically requested you for this mission. Says you're the only one who knows those canyons well enough to find them." A murmur ran through the gathered soldiers. Naalnish caught the sideways glances, the barely suppressed snickers about the half-pint Apache being their best hope. He had endured worse. Growing up between 2 worlds, 2 Apache for the white settlements, 2 different for many in his own tribe, had taught him that respect was earned through results, not stature. "When do we ride?" he asked simply. "Now," Harrison replied. "Take point. We'll follow at distance until you pick up the trail." Naalnish swung onto Ayoe with practiced ease, his short legs finding the stirrups he had adjusted perfectly for his frame. The pony responded immediately to his touch, and they moved out of the fort at a steady trot. Behind him, he could hear the cavalry horses' larger hooves thundering against the packed earth, but he focused ahead on the task before him. The Morrison Ranch lay 12 miles south, and Naalnish knew the route well. He had scouted this territory for 3 years now, ever since the Apache Wars had forced him to choose sides, or rather, to choose survival. His own band had been decimated in the conflicts, and his physical limitations made him unsuitable for the warrior path his cousins had taken. Working for the cavalry was pragmatic, even if it earned him the contempt of both peoples. As they approached the ranch, the acrid smell of smoke still hung in the desert air. The main house stood untouched, but the stable and part of the bunkhouse showed signs of hasty fire damage. Naalnish dismounted and examined the ground with the thoroughness that had made his reputation. The story was written in disturbed earth and scattered belongings. 4 horses unshod, definitely Apache ponies. The attack had been swift and surgical, aimed at capture rather than destruction. Most tellingly, there were no blood spatters near the house, suggesting Catherine Morrison had been taken alive and unharmed. "Trail leads northeast," Naalnish confirmed, remounting Ayoe. "Maybe 6 hours old. They're moving fast but not pushing their horses. They want to reach the high country before we can organize pursuit." Lieutenant Harrison nodded grimly. "Can you track them?" Naalnish looked toward the distant mountains, their peaks already shimmering in the growing heat. Somewhere up there, a young woman was riding toward an uncertain fate, carried deeper into country that would test every skill he possessed. "I can find them," he said quietly. "But Lieutenant, if we catch up to them in the canyons, your cavalry tactics won't work. That's Apache country up there. They know every rock, every hiding place." "Then it's a good thing we have an Apache tracker," Harrison replied, though his tone suggested he placed little faith in Naalnish's abilities beyond following hoofprints. As they rode out from the ranch, Naalnish felt the familiar weight of expectation and doubt pressing down on him. The soldiers behind him saw only his limitations, his size, his mixed loyalties, his inability to fit neatly into either world. But Ayoe responded to his gentle guidance with absolute trust, and ahead lay a trail that would demand every skill his unusual life had taught him. The sun climbed higher, promising another scorching Arizona day, and somewhere in the vast wilderness ahead, Catherine Morrison awaited rescue by a tracker who could only ride ponies, but who knew these lands better than any man, regardless of his stature. By midday, the patrol had climbed 2,000 feet into the Mogollon Rim country, where the desert gave way to pine forests and rocky outcroppings that could hide an army. Naalnish rode ahead of the column, reading sign with the patience his grandmother had taught him in childhood. Every broken twig, every displaced stone told part of the story. The Apache war party was being clever, splitting up and rejoining their trail, using rocky ground to obscure their passage, even backtracking once to throw off pursuit. But they couldn't hide everything, not from someone who had learned tracking before he could properly walk. "They're heading for Devil's Canyon," Naalnish called back to Lieutenant Harrison as they paused to rest the horses. "It's perfect Apache country. Narrow passages, plenty of cover, water sources they know, and we don't." Harrison dismounted and walked over to where Naalnish sat atop Ayoi, studying a patch of disturbed pine needles. Even on horseback, the Apache tracker was barely at eye level with the standing lieutenant. "How much farther?" Harrison asked, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cooler mountain air. "Maybe 2 hours to the canyon mouth, but Lieutenant—" Naalnish paused, choosing his words carefully. "Once we enter that canyon, we're committed. There are only 2 ways out. The way we came and a narrow pass at the far end that leads to Apache strongholds in the White Mountains. If they're waiting for us—" "You think it's a trap?" Naalnish studied the trail ahead, noting how the hoofprints seemed more deliberate here, less concerned with concealment. "Maybe, or maybe they just feel safe enough in their own territory to stop running." He looked up at Harrison. "Either way, your cavalry charge won't work in there. The canyon's too narrow, too many places for ambush." Sergeant O'Malley had been listening and now spat tobacco juice into the pine needles. "So what do you suggest, Half-Pint? We just let them get away with the girl?" The familiar insult stung, but Naalnish had learned not to react. "I go ahead alone. Scout the canyon, see where they've made camp. If the girl is unharmed, and it's possible, I can get her out quietly. If not," he shrugged, "at least we'll know what we're facing." "Absolutely not," Harrison said firmly. "You're valuable as a tracker, but you're not a rescue operation by yourself. We stick together." As they argued, Naalnish's sharp ears caught a sound that made him hold up a hand for silence. The distant whinny of a horse carried on the mountain breeze. He pointed toward a cluster of rocks about a quarter-mile ahead. "Someone's there," he whispered. "Could be a lookout." The patrol dismounted and took cover, while Naalnish and 2 soldiers crept forward through the pines. What they found was a single Apache warrior, older than expected, sitting beside a small fire with his horse grazing nearby. But it was what Naalnish saw beside him that made his blood run cold. Catherine Morrison's torn blue dress, stained with blood. The warrior looked up as they approached, showing no surprise or fear. He was perhaps 60, his face lined with the scars of many battles, and he regarded Naalnish with particular interest. "You are the one they call Naalnish," the warrior said in Apache, his voice carrying the authority of years. "The small one who tracks for the bluecoats." "I am," Naalnish replied in the same language, aware that the soldiers behind him couldn't understand the exchange. "And you are?" "Goyakla's cousin, Niall. We took the white woman as justice for what her father did to our people at Cyberq Creek." Naalnish's heart sank. The Cyberq incident had been a massacre, with Morrison's hired guns killing Apache women and children during a supposed peace negotiation. If this was about revenge, Catherine Morrison's chances of survival had just dropped dramatically. "Where is she?" he asked. Niall gestured toward the canyon. "Safe for now, but that depends on what you choose to do, little cousin." "What do you mean?" The old warrior stood, his movements still fluid despite his age. "The blue coats behind you. They see only a captive to rescue and Apache to kill. But you understand that some debts must be paid." Lieutenant Harrison grew impatient behind them. "What's he saying, Naalnish?" Before he could answer, Niall continued in Apache. "The girl is brave. She shows no fear, asks for no mercy. Perhaps she should not pay for her father's sins." He paused meaningfully. "Walk with me, cousin. Let us speak of justice and choices." Naalnish found himself at a crossroads he had dreaded since taking employment with the cavalry. His loyalty to the soldiers who distrusted him, his duty to rescue an innocent woman, and his understanding of Apache justice, all pulling him in different directions. "The warrior wants to parley," he told Harrison, switching back to English. "Says he might be willing to release the woman under certain conditions." "What conditions?" Niall, who understood more English than he let on, smiled grimly. "Tell them, little tracker, that some conversations are best held between warriors, not in front of those who would not understand the weight of honor." As the mountain wind whispered through the pines, Naalnish realized that his tracking skills had brought them to more than just Catherine Morrison's trail. They had led him to a moment where his mixed heritage would either doom them all or provide the key. to a solution no pure-blood soldier could achieve. The canyon ahead waited, holding secrets and dangers that would test more than his ability to read sign in the wilderness. Against Lieutenant Harrison's protests, Naalnish rode alone into Devil's Canyon with Nael, leaving the cavalry patrol hidden among the rocks. The canyon walls rose like cathedral spires on either side, their red stone faces marked with ancient petroglyphs that told stories older than memory. Aoi picked her way carefully along the narrow trail, her hooves echoing softly in the confined space. "Your pony is well trained," Nael observed, riding beside him on a paint horse that seemed too large for the narrow path. "Most white men's horses would be spooked by these walls." "She was born in canyon country," Naalnish replied. "Like me." They rounded a bend and emerged into a hidden valley perhaps 200 yards across, with a clear spring, bubbling up from the rocks and grass green enough to support a small herd. It was a perfect Apache hideout: water, grazing, and only one way in or out that could be easily defended. Two younger warriors rose from beside a small cook fire, their rifles ready but not raised, and there, sitting on a blanket near the spring, was Catherine Morrison. Naalnish's first impression was that she looked nothing like what he had expected from a wealthy rancher's daughter. Her long auburn hair hung loose around her shoulders, and though her blue dress was torn and stained, she sat with a straight back and alert eyes that missed nothing. When she saw him, her gaze lingered with curiosity rather than fear. "You brought the small tracker," one of the younger warriors said in Apache, not bothering to hide his disdain. "What can he do that our rifles cannot?" "Watch your tongue, Bijoshi," Nael warned. "This one has earned his place through skill, not size." Catherine Morrison stood as they approached, and Naalnish was surprised to see that she was tall for a woman, nearly as tall as Lieutenant Harrison. Standing next to her, his own diminutive stature would be even more pronounced. "Miss Morrison," he said in English, dismounting from Aoi, "I'm Naalnish. I'm here with the cavalry to bring you home safely." She studied him with intelligent green eyes. "You're Apache?" "Yes, ma'am." "But you work for the soldiers who are hunting these men?" "Yes, ma'am." To his surprise, she didn't seem shocked or offended by this apparent contradiction. Instead, she glanced toward Nael and asked, "Do you speak their language?" "I do." "Then perhaps you can explain something to me." Catherine moved closer, lowering her voice. "They keep talking about my father and something called Sibique Creek. What happened there?" Naalnish felt the weight of Nael's attention as he chose his words carefully. 3 months ago, there was a meeting between Apache leaders and local ranchers. Your father was there with some hired guns. The Apache say it was supposed to be a peace negotiation, but—" He paused, seeing her face change as understanding dawned. "But it wasn't," she finished quietly. 17 Apache died that day, Miss Morrison, women and children among them." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from Naalnish to the Apache warriors, who watched her with expressions ranging from hostility to curiosity. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "I didn't know," she said simply. "My father told me they were cattle rustlers who had been driven off the property." She looked directly at Nael, though she knew he couldn't understand her English. "Were any of these men's families killed that day?" "Bijoshi's sister and her baby," Naalnish translated quietly. "Nael's grandson." The young woman's face paled, but she didn't look away. "Ask them what they want from me. What would satisfy their need for justice?" This wasn't what Naalnish had expected from a sheltered rancher's daughter. Most white women in her situation would be demanding immediate rescue, weeping with fear or fainting from shock. Instead, Catherine Morrison was asking about justice with the same directness he had heard from Apache matriarchs deciding matters of tribal law. When he translated her question, the 3 Apache warriors exchanged surprised glances. Nael stepped forward and spoke at length in Apache, his weathered hands moving to emphasize his points. "He says," Naalnish interpreted, "that they expected you to beg and cry like most white women. He says your father's debt cannot be paid by your blood. That would make them no better than him, but neither can it go unpaid." "What does he suggest?" Before Naalnish could translate, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the canyon entrance. Everyone tensed, hands moving to weapons, but Naalnish recognized the rhythm. Cavalry horses approaching at a walk, trying to be quiet, but failing in the acoustics of the narrow canyon. "The soldiers followed us," Bijoshi said angrily in Apache. "This was a trap." "No," Nael said firmly, studying Naalnish's face. "The small tracker is not a deceiver. Someone else made this choice." Lieutenant Harrison's voice boomed from the canyon mouth. "We know you're in there. Release the woman and we'll let you ride out peacefully." Catherine Morrison looked at Naalnish with sudden understanding. They're not going to let these men ride away peacefully, are they? No, ma'am, I don't believe they are. Then we have a problem, she said, surprising him again with her calm assessment of their situation. Because I'm beginning to think justice might be more complicated than just rescue. The sound of cavalry horses grew closer, and Naalnish found himself at the center of a situation that would require more than tracking skills to resolve. In the space of minutes, his simple rescue mission had become something far more complex, a question of justice, honor, and the price of violence that stretched back generations. Ayoe nickered softly beside him, sensing the tension that filled the hidden valley like gathering storm clouds. The cavalry patrol entered the hidden valley with weapons drawn, Lieutenant Harrison in the lead, and Sergeant O'Malley flanking him. The sight that greeted them was not what they had expected. Catherine Morrison standing calmly beside the Apache warriors, apparently unrestrained, while Naalnish sat cross-legged on the ground between the two groups. "Step away from the hostiles, Miss Morrison!" Harrison shouted, his revolver aimed at Nail's chest. "They're not hostiles," Catherine replied, her voice carrying clearly across the valley. "They're men seeking justice for wrongs done to their families." "Ma'am, you're clearly suffering from some kind of shock," O'Malley said, though he kept his rifle trained on Bijoshi. "These savages kidnapped you." "Sergeant," Catherine's voice turned sharp with authority, "I am perfectly capable of understanding my situation. These men took me to make a point about my father's actions at Cybercue Creek, a point that, frankly, needs to be made." Harrison's face reddened. "Your father is paying us to bring you home safely, not to listen to Apache propaganda." The tension crackled like lightning in the mountain air. Naalnish could see Bijoshi's finger tightening on his rifle trigger, could feel the moment sliding toward violence that would serve no one's cause. He stood slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Lieutenant," he said carefully, "Miss Morrison is right. There's more to this than a simple kidnapping. If we can work out an agreement, the only agreement we need," O'Malley interrupted, "is for these Apache to surrender and face justice for their crimes." "What crimes?" Catherine demanded, stepping forward despite the weapons pointed in every direction. "Taking me without harming me? Feeding me? Giving me water? Treating me with more respect than many white men have shown?" She gestured toward the Apache warriors. "Or do you mean the crime of surviving my father's massacre of their families?" "Miss Morrison, you don't understand," Harrison began. "I understand perfectly." Her voice echoed off the canyon walls. "I understand that 17 innocent people died at Cybercue Creek because my father wanted their land. I understand that these men have every right to seek justice, and I understand that if shooting starts here, more innocent blood will be spilled." Nael spoke quietly in Apache, and Naalnish translated, "He says the white woman has a warrior's heart. He asks if she would be willing to help find a solution that honors the dead without creating more of them." "What kind of solution?" Harrison demanded. Before Naalnish could respond, Catherine spoke directly to Nael in carefully pronounced Apache words. "What would honor your dead?" The old warrior's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with something approaching respect. He replied in simple Apache that she might understand. "Truth, justice, your father to face consequences." Catherine turned back to the soldiers. "I won't leave this valley until we find a way to address what my father did. These men deserve justice, not more violence." "Ma'am, with all due respect," Harrison said through gritted teeth, "you don't have a choice in the matter. We're taking you out of here." "Are you?" Catherine asked quietly. Then, to everyone's shock, she walked over to where Bijoshi stood and calmly placed herself between his rifle and the soldiers. "Because it seems to me that if you start shooting, you'll have to go through me first." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Naalnish could see the calculation in Harrison's eyes, the impossibility of rescuing Catherine by force when she was actively protecting her captors. But he could also see the rage building in O'Malley, the kind of fury that led to massacres. "There's another way," Naalnish said into the silence. "Miss Morrison, you said your father told you these men were cattle rustlers." "Yes. What if the truth came out? What if people knew what really happened at Cybercue Creek?" "The territorial governor would have to investigate," Catherine said slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "There would be charges, trials." "Your father has powerful friends," Harrison warned. "It would be your word against his." "No," Nael said in English, surprising everyone. "Not her word alone." He gestured to his companions. "We have witnesses, and—" He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch. From it, he withdrew a folded paper, stained with age and blood. "What is that?" Catherine asked. Naalnish examined the document and felt his heart skip. It's a letter from your father to his foreman. Instructions for the meeting at Cybercue Creek. It makes it clear the massacre was planned. Catherine took the letter with shaking hands, reading her father's familiar handwriting, as it laid out a cold-blooded scheme to eliminate the Apache families who wouldn't sell their water rights. When she finished, tears ran down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. This ends it, she said. This ensures justice will be done through law, not through more killing. And if we let them ride away with this evidence? Harrison asked. What guarantee do we have they won't just disappear into Mexico? Naalnish looked at Catherine for a long moment, then at Naalnish. When he spoke, it was in Apache, but his meaning was clear to everyone present. He says, Naalnish translated, that they'll surrender themselves to territorial authorities in Prescott if Miss Morrison gives her word that she'll testify to what she's learned here. And if she doesn't? O'Malley demanded. The old warrior's smile was grim. Then we disappear into the mountains, and justice becomes a matter for Apache law. Catherine looked around the valley, at the soldiers who had come to rescue her, at the Apache warriors who had treated her with unexpected honor, at the tracker whose mixed heritage had made this moment possible. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decision. I give my word, she said. We'll face this together, through the law, with the truth as our weapon, instead of bullets. The sun was beginning to set behind the canyon walls, painting the red stone in shades of gold and crimson. In the growing twilight, enemies slowly lowered their weapons and began the difficult process of becoming allies in the cause of justice, a process that would test them all in ways the desert had never could. 6 months later, the territorial courthouse in Prescott buzzed with activity as the final day of Jeremiah Morrison's trial concluded. Catherine sat in the front row, her testimony having been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Beside her, in a chair modified for his height, Naalnish watched as the jury filed back in with their verdict. Guilty on all charges of conspiracy to commit murder and theft of federal lands, the foreman announced. Catherine felt no satisfaction in her father's conviction, only a deep sadness for the families destroyed by his greed. But justice had been served through law rather than violence, and the Apache witnesses who had testified were free men, their courage in facing a white jury having helped secure the conviction. As the crowd dispersed, Naalnish approached their seats. The old warrior had spent the winter months working with territorial authorities, and the experience had aged him, but his dignity remained undiminished. It is finished, he said in English, his command of the language much improved. The dead can rest. What will you do now? Catherine asked. Return to my people. Tell them that sometimes justice can be found in the white man's courts. He looked at Naalnish. And you, little cousin? Will you continue tracking for the blue coats? Naalnish glanced at Catherine, then shook his head. I think my tracking days are done. I've been offered a position as interpreter and cultural liaison with the Indian Agency, work that might help prevent more Cybercue creeks. Catherine had been dreading this conversation for weeks. During the trial, she and Naalnish had spent countless hours together, he helping her understand Apache culture and perspectives, she helping him navigate the complex world of territorial politics and law. What had begun as mutual respect had deepened into something neither had expected. But Catherine was now a wealthy woman in her own right, having inherited half her father's estate, while the other half was awarded as compensation to the Apache families. Naalnish remained a man caught between worlds, respected for his skills, but still facing prejudice for his mixed heritage and physical differences. Catherine, Naalnish said quietly as they walked out of the courthouse, there's something I need to say before we go our separate ways. She stopped on the courthouse steps, her heart clenching at his words. Separate ways. You know as well as I do that society won't accept. He gestured at the difference in their heights, their races, their stations in life. People like us don't have fairy tale endings. Catherine studied his face, the weathered features that spoke of a hard life lived with dignity, the dark eyes that saw everything and judged with fairness few possessed, the quiet strength that had impressed even Lieutenant Harrison by the end of their ordeal. Naalnish, she said, using the Apache pronunciation he had taught her, do you remember what you told me about your pony that first day in the canyon? He looked puzzled, that she was born in canyon country. You said she was perfect for you, not because she was the biggest or the strongest or the most beautiful horse, but because she was right. Catherine stepped closer, ignoring the curious stares of passers-by. 6 months ago, I was a sheltered rancher's daughter, who thought the world was divided into simple categories of right and wrong. You showed me that justice is more complicated, that honor comes in unexpected packages, and that courage isn't measured in feet and inches. Catherine, I'm not finished. Her voice carried the same authority that had silenced soldiers in Devil's Canyon. The Indian agency position comes with a house in Flagstaff and a salary that would support a family. You'd be working to build bridges between two peoples, using your unique perspective to prevent the kind of tragedy that brought us together. And you? He asked quietly. The trial made me something of a celebrity. Newspapers are calling me the angel of justice for standing up to my own father. She smiled ruefully. Several Eastern colleges have offered me teaching positions in their new programs for the education of young women. Respectable work for a spinster with a scandalous past. Naalnish's face fell at her words, but Catherine wasn't finished. Ornan, she continued, I could use my father's money to establish a school in Flagstaff, a place where Apache and white children could learn together, where someone who understands both cultures could help train teachers in cross-cultural education. She paused, her heart pounding. That school would need an administrator, someone who could ride between two worlds and help others do the same. Catherine, what are you saying? I'm saying that maybe we don't need a fairy tale ending. Maybe we just need an honest one. She reached down and took his weathered hand in hers. I'm saying that size doesn't matter when two people are meant to ride together. I'm saying that I'd rather face society's judgment with you than live safely without you. For a moment, Naalnish couldn't speak. Then, his voice rough with emotion, he said, People will stare. They'll whisper. Some will be cruel. Let them, Catherine replied firmly. We've faced down armed men in a canyon standoff. We've stood up in court against one of the territory's most powerful ranchers. We've helped prevent a war and secured justice for the innocent. Do you really think a few small-minded gossips are going to intimidate us now? A year later, the Flagstaff Cross-Cultural School opened its doors with 36 students, 18 Apache children and 18 white children, learning together under the guidance of Catherine Morrison Naalnish and her husband, the school's director of cultural programs. Their wedding had been the scandal of the territory, but their work spoke louder than whispers. On the school's first day, as Catherine watched her husband address the mixed group of students in both English and Apache, she remembered something Nael had told her in the canyon. Honor is not about the size of a warrior, but about the size of his heart. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their small house watching the sunset paint the San Francisco peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Catherine rested her hand on Naalnish's shoulder. Any regrets? She asked. He looked up at her with a smile that had grown more frequent over the months they'd been together. Only that I spent so many years thinking I was too small for this world to notice. Well, Catherine said, leaning down to kiss him, you were wrong about that. You're exactly the right size for the life we're building together. In the distance, Ioe grazed peacefully in their small pasture, alongside Catherine's mare, two horses of different sizes, perfectly matched for the riders who had chosen to make their own kind of forever. One that had nothing to do with fairy tales and everything to do with two hearts, brave enough to ride together through whatever canyon lay ahead.